ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary nerds. Welcome to my small session about Frontend Minimalism, how to maybe do more with slightly less. That's the general idea. And I think this is worth talking about because doing less kind of doesn't match the current vibe, right? The current vibe is somewhat more about, doing ever more, maybe having ever more being generated, and us being responsible for this and dealing with the consequences, which are that, sometimes stuff doesn't work out as imagined. And I'm going to try to make the opposite case, essentially, and talk about how I think we can benefit from a general philosophy of minimalism when we do front-end work. Hi, I'm Peter, and I'm your front-end technology trash panda, and also I'm a developer relations engineer for Storyblock. And since the company literally pays me to be here and to talk to you today, you now have to endure a 30-second ad. Please hold. What's Storyblock? Storyblock is a headless content management system, and I don't think I need to explain to you what a content management system or a headless content management system is, right? It's a software as a service deal. You log in, get an application, bunch of forms, create your content. The headless content management system has an API that you can build an application for using whatever technology you desire. You can even use PHP or mobile SDKs nowadays. It's really quite advanced, but this is not really the interesting thing about Storyblock specifically. We have another trick up our sleeves, and that's the Bridge API. And this essentially means that you build your components for your front end, and automatically, without you doing anything, these components are also used inside the application itself, which means that your content editors get a live visual preview without, again, anyone having to do anything, which is quite neat. Again, you as developers don't have to do anything. This is a freebie. And if you think this is interesting, click this, scan this QR code to visit Storyblock. This also includes tracking information so they know that I sent them. And the QR code will reappear at the end, so we don't have to spend too much time on this. Ad over. Okay, this wasn't too bad, right? So let's talk about why we are really here, which is how we can maybe achieve a little bit more by doing a little bit less. First, we are going to define what minimalism really means in the context of front-end development and why we might want to be minimalist. And then the most important bit is, well, how do we actually implement this? Because it's easy to say simply use less stuff to do more, but how can this actually work? How can this be implemented, and what are the benefits that we might get from this? And then, of course, we also need to talk about the cases where minimalism alone just doesn't cut it, and where we might need to dip our toes into, regular, professional web development like everybody else seems to be doing today. This here says there's time at the end. There may not be, so if you have any questions, simply interrupt me. The same goes for the remote participants. Simply type something into the chat. There's a good chance that I will actually see what you type. Okay. Then let's get started. Why do we want to be minimalist when we build front-end applications? Well, there's three good reasons, which are performance, stability, and productivity. Okay, starting with the obvious bit first, performance. Like, what's the fastest possible program? The fastest possible program can only be one thing. It can be the program that only performs the strictly required operations. Can't do anything more because that's waste and not maximum performance, and it can't do less because then it's not our program anymore. So in order to be fast, the only way to get there is to cut down on unnecessary operations. Okay, there's edge cases. So rendering a progress bar obviously isn't strictly necessary to copying files, but it makes the program feel faster. But this is an edge case. This is something that's strictly related to more or less helping users along, but when we really get down to measuring how long something takes, then this doesn't help us. This simply, helps with the user experience, which is not unimportant, but this is not what I'm talking about. I really want to talk about boiling our front-end applications down to the bare essentials, which is more or less what Wikipedia tells me that the definition of minimalism actually is. Okay, sounds good. And we all agree that there's no code that's as fast as no code, but how can we actually implement this? How should we think about this in front-end development? Well, it's quite easy. In front-end development, there's essentially three layers that we have to deal with as web developers. First, there's the operating system layer, which is, Windows, Linux, what have you. And this is important for web developers because there are some fundamental features of the operating system layer, like which built-in fonts are available. So there's a way in which we have to care about this, but it's really not the deciding factor. And then there's the platform, which is our browsers, Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and everything else. This is more important to us because this is the platform that we directly interact with. Browser bugs affect us directly. And then finally, the biggest layer, and the one that we seem to be most concerned with these days, it's the library layer, where we have our frameworks, our libraries, and these guys usually form sort of a lens through which developers view their entire projects. They aren't web developers anymore, they conceive of themselves as Angular developers or React developers or something like this. And this is essentially the three-layer tower that we have to deal with in web development, with ever-increasing importance the higher up we go. Now, there's a few interesting bits about these different layers of the platform. The operating system, in theory, can change. Somebody can update their Windows version, other fonts become available, and again, the operating system layer doesn't concern us that much. But the middle layer is much more interesting, because that's browser land, and browsers, as I've said before, directly affect us. And if we have to deal with browsers that much, then we should probably put in some work to actually understand what browsers want to do and how they work and how they go after their goals. And the only goal that browsers really have in today's world is to display web pages. And by web pages, I mean all web pages. Every web page ever built, every web page ever conceived. From the oldest Web 1.0 animated GIF marquee and blink-infested hellhole to the nicest, most bloated AI product page that you can imagine today. That's all web pages, and browsers want to support all web pages. And in order to do this, browsers cannot really get rid of any features, or really can't change any features. I mean, if you've ever written a line of JavaScript, you probably know this. You come across something strange, and the reason for it being there is it has always been there since the early 90s, and you just have to deal with it. Now, this sounds like a problem if you cannot ever fix your platform, but it's also a benefit, because every code that you've ever written, if it just depends on browser APIs, will continue to run for all eternity. By definition, because a browser that cleans up and repairs APIs turns itself into a worse browser, because it's no longer able to display all the pages it was able to display previously. And this is actually something that we could benefit from. I mean, in the front end with all the libraries, we have permanent updates and churn and breaking changes all over the place, but this doesn't happen with browsers. Let me demonstrate this. Let's try to change a page's background color from HTML. From HTML, mind you, not from CSS. How can we change background colors with HTML? Well, with the trusty style attribute and CSS, yes, but CSS is cheating. This is barely readable. But trust me, this says background body BG color blue, which is an ancient feature from Web 1.0 times, but one that still works. Nobody needs this because we can all use CSS nowadays, and there's no reason for this feature existing, except for the fact that there's a whole bunch of web pages out there that browsers still want to support. And so they still implement this ancient feature even though nobody cares about this. This has been unchanged in browsers since the early, not the early 90s, but the mid-90s, let's say. And it has never changed. If you build your page using this feature, it has kept working forever. It works with color keywords, it works with hex values, and it even works with things that aren't really colors, like Chuck Norris, for example. Yes, Chuck Norris turns into a color. Why does Chuck Norris turn into a color? Well, you know the answer. Because it always has. This has always been the case, even since the mid-90s, even though Chuck Norris jokes weren't even a thing back then. Why does this still work? Well, let me explain. Chuck Norris, to nobody's surprise, is not a color name, right? It's not red, not green, not blue, and it's also not a hexadecimal color value, but maybe we can turn it into a hexadecimal color value. So let's add the hash sign in front and then turn it into a color value step by step. First, these characters don't fit into the hexadecimal alphabet, so we should probably replace them with zeros, because why not? Then we need to build up 3 color channels, red, green, and blue. To do this, the number of characters in the string needs to be divisible by 3. That's not the case currently, so let's add more zeros until that's the case. Then we can create 3 color channels, split them in groups, take the groups, shorten the groups, and presto, we have a color value. And this is part of the HTML standard. This is what browsers still support. They have unit tests that check for this behavior. They really take their backwards compatibility quite seriously. So in this sense, building web applications should be something that you do once, and you write it once and it runs anywhere because you work with a platform that is fundamentally incapable of breaking changes. All right, yeah, there's exceptions like Flash or, HTTP without the S at the end, but these are exceptions that prove the rule. In general, once a feature is out there, it will never go away. And therefore, web development as we know it is stable, it's never confronted with any breaking changes or any other churn, right? Right? Well, not quite, because there's other factors in play here. The top layer of our stack, the library layer. And the library layer here represented by node modules, is of course the layer that has a whole bunch of churn. And this, I think, is quite the drag on web developer productivity, because in my mind, the most productive developers are those that are allowed to focus on the task at hand. And when it comes to focusing on building value, creating something that people actually want to use, then this guy doesn't really help. I mean, maybe the new version of the framework is better in some way, but is it really better in a way that affects your overall product? Chances are it is, but it might as well not be. So getting rid of eternal update churn is something that, in my mind, looks quite attractive. And the only lever that we can actually pull to have to deal with less updates is actually the top stack, is where we work, is where all the libraries and frameworks and so on live. This is why we can implement minimalism. We cannot influence the operating system, and we actually, considering minimalism, don't want to change anything about the platform because the platform is as stable as it's ever going to be. So this is why we want minimalism. We want more performance by having less JavaScript bloat to lug around. We want more productivity by having to run less updates for no reason. And the stability that the browser platform in theory provides is something that we could really use in practice. So we should simply get rid of a whole bunch of code, because if we don't have code to deal with, then we have nothing that eats up some time to run. Code that isn't there cannot waste performance. It also doesn't need to be downloaded, that doesn't clog up the data, and it never contains any surprises. And I think this is quite the salient point nowadays. Like, breaking changes are bad, but this is at least a known quantity. But nowadays, I feel like every second dependency is also infested by malware and unplanned regressions, and of course, everything that we do to minimize our reliance on third-party code can still coexist with any third-party code that we opt to use. Because at the end, everything is HTML and CSS and JavaScript. These are the fundamental forces, and everything needs to interact with this in some way. So if we can throw something out, the rest should, in theory, keep working. Okay, this sounds good, so let's implement this. I mean, I don't know about you, but these sound like quite obvious things. We want more performance. More code makes less performance, so let's remove code. That's probably something that we all, in some way, kind of want to do, but don't know about you, but I find this sometimes to be really hard. Why is it so hard to implement this? Why is it easier to add stuff to a project and it's much harder to remove stuff from a project? Why is this? Well, I think this is down to threats. Let's do something that an airline pilot would do and do a little bit of threat and error management. We have a goal, we want to land over there, what could go wrong? And let's plan for all the contingencies. Because a big-brained person might say minimalism is simply good engineering, and obviously you should do this and you shouldn't add anything that you don't need, but this is easier said than done in this atmosphere that we have. Because I think nobody wakes up and decides to add unnecessary bloat to their project, right? Have you ever done this? I certainly haven't. I always get out of bed and think, this time I will keep the download sizes in check. This time it will be snappy in the front end. There will be no lag, no distractions, no nothing. But I sometimes end up with something that's not quite minimalist. I pick the giant library, the monstrous framework, the stuff that I'm used to. And the reason for me picking the wrong turn at each and every decision point, in my mind, is threats. Threats that we can quantify and that we can name, and we can talk about them, name them, and then decide whether or not a threat that pops up is something that we actually should consider. If we should listen to whatever tries to get us off the path towards a minimalist solution. So let's talk about threats. And the first threat is that we try to solve problems that don't actually exist, also known as you ain't gonna need it. So this is solving problems that do not warrant consideration given current circumstances. And to avoid this threat, we probably need to really understand our domain, what we are working with. So let me give you a problem that I encountered, that somebody brought to me, and how a threat, a very specific threat, tried to veer this person off course. The threat in this case is the solution vendor. And this is essentially the person or company or product that tells you that you have a problem that you definitely need solved, and they just happen to have just the solution for you. You definitely need their new shiny thing to solve something that you may or may not be confronted with. So the story goes that a developer that I won't name came to me and asked me to help him with picking front-end tooling for his PHP web application. This was meant to be a tiny little application for his company, for internal use only, where they only use Chrome, and he was a PHP developer by trade and was interested to understand if web components or Next.js would be a better fit for his problem. Now, if I say it like this, it kind of sounds obvious. Does this guy need something like Next.js, or does he need to dive deep into web components? Is it even necessary to have something that, along other things, smooths over browser differences? The question is not which kind of front-end tooling this guy needed. The question was, did he need any front-end tooling at all? And my answer to him in this case was, you probably don't. Because what was his biggest concern? I mean, this guy was a PHP developer, and he didn't really want to dabble in front-end. And what's the worst part about front-end development from a PHP developer's point of view? That's right, it's CSS. And both of these technologies, Next.js and web components, have a solution for this because they come with built-in functionality to scope CSS and to contain it and to keep it just applicable to certain components and not the complete application, so that you can, get out of the rat race towards adding ever more stuff to your ever-expanding CSS file. But turns out this person only had to develop this tiny internal application, and he was only supposed to support Chrome, because this is the browser that the internal company was using. And nowadays, there's a feature that works in every browser, but back then, like a year ago, it only worked in Chrome, and you've probably used this. It's the scope rule for CSS, which, scopes CSS. You don't need to do anything for this. It's built into every browser nowadays, and back then it was built into Chrome. So this wasn't even a problem that this guy had to solve. He didn't need any front-end tooling. He just needed to know that this thing existed, and he could then simply stay in his lane, build a PHP application, use Twig templates, and what have you, without ever touching front-end tooling, without adding megabytes of JavaScript, breaking changes, dependencies, and malware attacks to his long list of problems that he faces as the sole developer for an internal web application. And, this sounds obvious in hindsight, but to him, since he wasn't really a front-end developer and he wasn't well versed into features that, again, at this time only existed in Chrome, this wasn't an obvious solution for him. But he got sidetracked, because what he was thinking of was, I need to build a front-end. And to build a front-end, you definitely need some sort of solution for a problem, and the solution can only ever be something that somebody sells to me. Okay, Next.js is free. Like, you can just download it, it's open source, and same thing with web component, you don't need to pay for this. But I still think it makes sense to talk about stuff like open source web frameworks and even certain narratives in web standards like web components as products. Because, let's be real, you don't pay for them directly most of the time, but they function as products. They are packaged solutions, they come with all sorts of bells and whistles, they have essentially teams doing marketing for them, right? Like, what am I doing when I give a talk about how awesome web components are? I'm doing free marketing for them because I'm a sucker. But this also turns web components into something that works like a product even though nobody has to pay. So solution vendors are kind of the problem. They tell you that you have a problem that can only ever be solved by jumping on this train or the other train. But you should probably take a close look at the platform that you're dealing with and the constraints that you're working under to decide whether or not you should listen to any of those. It's not a choice between solution vendor A and solution vendor B. It's also always possible to just roll your own, which sounds crazy, but in this guy's case, it was simply a way of write your CSS in a different wrapper. So be careful when people try to sell you stuff, even though the stuff might not really cost you anything in dollar terms. Related to this, let's talk about moving problems to the platform, talking about adapting web standards and not reinventing them. And the problem with this is we've talked about how the browser can only ever get new features and nothing ever goes away, which means that the entire API surface of the web platform, meaning CSS, HTML, and everything else to it, only ever grows, which makes it quite hard to keep an overview over everything. And this is kind of the threat. But in general, you should assume that the browser can do way more than you expect. And even if you consider yourself to be quite up to date with all the latest web standards, you can still fall into the trap of simply not expecting the browser to be able to do anything. Let me tell you another story about another guy who failed to understand what browsers can do. This time, the guy is me. I wanted to compress some data and went on a tangent that really wasn't worth going on. Again, the important bit about moving stuff to the platform is that you get away from everything that's broken about web development today. You don't need any giant dependencies and you will never have breaking changes if you simply use the APIs that are already there. The only problem is that what you might be dealing with might be a somewhat suboptimal solution. It might be slightly annoying to use. I mean, all the flashy frameworks are there for a reason, and they are as successful as they are for a reason. They provide a great developer experience, and, you know, manually stacking diffs on top of other diffs isn't quite as convenient as writing an application using Next.js, for example. But it's really just the convenience factor. The convenience factor isn't not important. It is important, but it's a matter of degree. You do not need the greatest developer experience on the planet if other factors are more important. I'm just saying, web standards may suck in some ways, but the rest of the platform may suck in different ways. So, here's my story. I wanted to compress some data in the front end and just, use a compression algorithm of some kind to make it smaller. Just a blob of JSON. And what I did is I literally spent hours, possibly days, going through NPM because, as you may expect, compress some data yields a whole bunch of packages. Very different packages using all sorts of algorithms that work good in the browser, acceptably in the browser, only if you really crowbar your way into the browser. Some need WebAssembly, some don't. Some use really modern compression algorithms. Some use stuff from the early 70s. So there's much to do, much to evaluate, much to sift through. And I spent days on this. I don't know why I didn't think of asking the browser if it was able to compress data, but it turns out that it actually is. Like, I compiled a giant list of NPM packages and I wasn't really happy with any of them, and then I found something else that I wasn't happy with, but that I eventually made work. Because it turns out browsers are good at compressing and decompressing data because they kind of have to be. I mean, you send your web resources as compressed data. This is not uncompressed text that you send over the wire. So they have all sorts of compression algorithms built in. And there is an API for this. Just a JavaScript API laying around in the browser, in every browser, even in Node.js, even in Dino. In every JavaScript platform, this guy is available, and I just didn't notice for days. The way this works is it uses the WebStream API, which is a tiny bit complicated, and I don't want to go into this right now. But suffice it to say that writing just a few lines of JavaScript code that's really not that complicated and really not that much, this gives you nice compression. There's not many compression algorithms to choose from. There's essentially only gzip and flavors of gzip, but this may be enough for your use case, depending on what you want to do. And the nice thing is, this is all. These 3 lines fulfill my use case of compressing some JSON data, it's asynchronous, it's not super convenient, it's not super advanced compression-wise, but still, it works everywhere without any dependencies and without any perspective of this ever having to be changed. This will always be like this, and I know this code will always be like this because it's already there. And if it's there, and if it works, and if I deploy a single website that uses this code, then I force browsers to keep supporting this as is for all eternity. Which is great. When's the last time you've built something truly to last? This is it. The only problem is I could have noticed this a tiny bit earlier, but there was a threat in the way, and the threat in this case was me and my lack of knowledge on what browsers can do. I don't have any quick fix for this because, as I said, the API surface is only ever going to get bigger. The browsers are only ever to get more complex, and you cannot know by heart everything that your Chrome or Firefox can do. But what I can tell you is to at least, no matter how ridiculous the idea is, to always first check for a browser API. If you want to do something, anything, whatever it might be, first take a look at the browsers. They may have something in store for you. I mean, Chrome nowadays has the Web Serial API, and Web MIDI APIs exist, and all other sorts of weird and wonderful APIs are there. Do they work for you? It depends. Do they solve your exact use case? Maybe not, but it's worth taking a look before you default to searching through NPM. Save yourself some time. Don't do what I did and default to NPM. Okay, and then finally, my maybe most controversial take in all of this is maybe it's actually worth rolling your own stuff sometimes. I've done this for a long time, and I think developers could do more of this. What we usually do as proper web developers is essentially write a whole bunch of glue code. Take a framework, take some UI component library, take our own stuff, and then essentially just wire it up. Just in giant air quotes, because we all know that this is rather complicated. But what we can do, and what we sometimes, I believe, should consider, is to build our own specialized bespoke solutions for specific problems. Because stuff that's specialized can be much more lightweight and much more fit for a specific purpose, even though best practices recommend the exact opposite. Do not roll your own X is something that gets hammered into our brains from an early stage. And in general, it's not a bad idea. We probably shouldn't default to developing specialized solutions, but I think this is an option that should always be on the table. This should always be available. We should always have the option to say, this package looks to be too unstable. The maintainer is a raging asshole. And many other reasons exist why you might just want to roll your own stuff. So for example, this guy right here compresses some data. But really, is it that important that this uses a standard API? Because there are NPM packages out there that also use this API. So what we are faced with now is a choice. We could either take this information, more or less discard it, and default to an NPM package that's maintained by some guy anyway, or we could take the extra step and write a bit of code around this API that's essentially a ready-made tiny library for our internal use. This is now my example, how I compress something to a base 64 string. Now, common wisdom would dictate that this is not worth it because there exists a ready-made library for this. But the problem with this ready-made library is, this may or may not be based in web standards. So this may be subject to breaking changes or it might not be, depending on how it works. If there are any breaking changes to my library, then I can decide to, roll breaking changes out, or maybe to not. I have control over the, in air quotes, product lifecycle. And this guy, this library that I just wrote, is extremely aligned with my specific use case. I needed to not just compress data, but to return the result, the compressed data, as a base 64 string, because I wanted to store my application's entire state in the URL as just a long string, as a search parameter, essentially. And yeah, this guy that I just wrote, this hunk of JavaScript here, is, strictly speaking, not necessary. I could as well have used a library, but this guy is entirely under my control. So, depending on your perspective, this is reinventing the wheel or the not invented here syndrome, but I think you could flip the narrative around and you could just as well call this vertical integration. You now own this piece of code and it's part of your platform that you built for yourself and it's powered by stable web standards. It works on your terms. And there's nobody out there who can decide to ruin your day by breaking this guy or turning it into something that's not aligned with your priorities. Maybe they suddenly start to slop it up with giant hunks of AI-generated code. And maybe you're totally on board with this, or maybe you're not. It really depends. But now you decide, and this piece of functionality, small as it may be, will never ruin your day, by definition. And come on, it's compressing data, using a built-in API into the browser. I believe in you. You can get this right, probably even better than whoever's developing this NPM package. And, you know, I'm a bit crazy about this. This applies to everything. If you really want to, you can roll your own everything. You can roll your own front-end framework. And I've definitely, back in the days when I was self-employed, visited companies that would have extremely benefited from rolling their own frameworks. If you have some use case that's not your standard web application, because just as an example, purely hypothetical, as a hypothetical example, if you use web technologies to build, for example, the infotainment system for a car, just as an idea, then you're probably confronted with two factors. One, your CPU is going to suck because it's ancient automotive, bullshit, and the screen in your luxury cars is only ever going to get bigger. This is a bad place to be in if you don't have the entire stack under your control. And maybe you run into extreme performance problems, and maybe you then wish you hadn't picked a framework that you then have to rip out parts out of anyway to somehow get this to an acceptable level. You're trying to build an infotainment system for a six-figure car, and you don't own the platform, which means that you're basically in the hands of fate. If you just had rolled your own, you would be controlling your own destiny. Maybe you shouldn't have picked web technology in the first place, but what do I know? I'm just saying, this should be an option that is on the table. You should always think of what you're trying to build, and if what you're trying to build could benefit from you doing stuff yourself. Now, of course, I cannot possibly build my own framework because, oh no, the maintenance burden. But remember what we are trying to achieve by building something ourselves. It's supposed to be specialized. So by definition, it doesn't have to appeal to everyone and everyone's use case. You're not building the next React. You are building something that takes the bit of React that you want and discards all the rest. If you didn't want to discard all the rest, why would you build something yourself? Just use something off the shelf. But by building something yourself, you can pick and choose what you care about and what you want to consider. I mean, this is an ancient meme, but I think it's kind of true. Like, if you don't know anything about the ecosystem, you probably start building your own stuff for everything. But then you learn about frameworks, and everything seems much easier unless you understand what the downsides are, and then you tend to sometimes special case your own stuff again. And this is just my opinion. Remember that all the successful big frameworks out there need to pitch to everybody. They need to be something for everybody. You should be able to use Angular for your mobile app, for your desktop app, for the infotainment system in your car. But whatever you build can simply be much simpler because you cut off all the things that you don't really need to care about, and everything is simpler. That's the power of specialization. You roll your own framework, but you don't roll something that's entirely equivalent to something that's already there, because why would you? I think this makes a whole bunch of sense. You just in air quotes again, need to get over the internal resistance. That tells you that you cannot possibly write something yourself because we have already done this. We have always done it this way. This is already available, and this is a trustworthy supplier. So just default to the regular thing and just deal with the consequences. No. Writing something yourself and owning it and doing vertical integration is an option that belongs on the table. So, what we should do in summary is first think if we can even if you even need to solve the problem that we are discussing. Is this an existing problem, or is this something that's solution vendors just tell us that need a packaged solution. Then, if we can offload some work onto the browser, we should definitely do it, because this is the most stable platform imaginable. And finally, we should always consider to reinvent the wheel, which isn't a bad idea if you need a specialized wheel and not something off the shelf. So, quite easy, but what happens if we need to say no to each and every one of these questions? What if the problem is real, and there's no lack of knowledge or tunnel vision going on, and we actually need to, install something from NPM? This might happen. What do we do instead of minimalism? How do we work with actually installing something from third parties? Well, I know, you know how to install something. You can just go npm install, and that's easy. But there are a few things to consider about doing this. The first thing is to remember that the alternative is the naked web platform, which has one giant advantage, and this advantage is that nothing ever breaks in browser land. Again, subtracting special cases like Flash and so on. But everything else that people build for the front end in terms of libraries and frameworks is always an abstraction around something that's already there. You cannot get rid of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That's always there. And if you pick some sort of framework or library that does something with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, then this is just a layer of user-defined code that is less universal, that can break around something that is universal and that can never break. Now, this doesn't mean that the abstraction layer isn't useful, because abstraction is useful. It's more or less the only trick we have in software development. But I mean, you know this diagram. Like, I don't need to tell you what happens when you rely on third-party vendors. And this is not necessarily anyone's fault. Like, software, you all know this, needs maintenance because requirements change, and essentially outside forces sometimes force us to adapt to certain things. This is just a fact of life, and the only ones that are more or less incapable of following the call of updating software to follow changing circumstances are the browsers themselves. That's their problem, and they have to work extremely hard to deal with it. We can simply benefit from it, but everything else, everything that's not as extremely constrained as a browser vendor, has to deal with changing circumstances, and this means updating our dependencies. So, let's say that an update is something that, we want to grudgingly accept. Like, okay, there's a new framework version out there, or maybe this library gets an update. And sometimes that's good. I don't know about you, but sometimes it's also something along the lines of, this is what my day really needed. Some more work that just slid into my schedule simply by virtue of somebody deciding to break some API. So in general, this is something that we could consider to be a risk. Like, a breaking change generally isn't good, always. At least not to start out with, at least not if we have to support a bunch of existing code. So, that's the risk calculation, right? Risk is the likelihood and the impact combined. That's the overall risk factor. And if we're talking about something like the likelihood of a weird package update ruining our day, the important question is if we can anticipate the likelihood. How likely is it that this or that package next week gets an update that ruins our day? Excuse me? No. Can we anticipate this? And the answer, in my experience, is no, we cannot. I mean, sure, there's software out there on defined release schedules. There's a new Angular version Okay. This is also a breaking change. Let me just turn it off and on again. That's a new one even for me. Please hold. Let me just see if it's maybe something with my device. Nope, there's just no screen being detected. Yeah, this is not ideal. How do we work around this real quick? I mean, nobody's there. We only have 5 more minutes. What can we do? Yeah, we just wait. That's it. I don't understand what happened, but where was I? You cannot predict when a library is going to break, because libraries may break for the dumbest of reasons. My personal favorite example from just a few weeks ago was that I was using a library that essentially just contained acceleration curves for like animations. Somewhere like you would define an acceleration curve for a CSS animation. So this, but in JavaScript. And it's acceleration curves. Is it possible for this package to have breaking changes? Well, it got 2 major version updates in the last few weeks. Because, now that we have AI, we obviously have to rewrite our acceleration curves. I don't think this is really necessary in many cases, and you cannot know if somebody gets bitten by bugs like these and suddenly decides to throw everything out and break your day. So the only thing that you can do if you don't know the likelihood of a dependency going haywire is to minimize your exposure. And I really need to drill this point home. You cannot anticipate whether or not a dependency will break, because people will break APIs for the dumbest of reasons. Breaking changes because now we pivot to AI. Maybe we suddenly, as the builders of this library, have diverging priorities. Maybe they suddenly want to go in this direction and you want to stay on this track. Well, you are screwed. And for many, many reasons in recent times, I don't know what's in the water, but I think project leaders tend to go nuts for the dumbest of reasons and pick decisions that are really, really not what you want in a stable product that just wants to keep working. So having less exposure to something like this is well worth it. And the only way to do this is to be deliberate about what you install and what you don't install. There's different classes, in my mind, of dependencies and how much they, for lack of a better word, they infest your program. If you just have a library that you call into that gets you a result for a given input, that's simple because this is something that you can that doesn't really ruin your day. I mean, in the worst case, you simply swap out the library and then you're done. But other kinds of dependencies really infest your code. And this is like the entirely integrated frameworks that really make your code not work in the absence of this framework. And this is much more problematic. Does this mean that frameworks are always evil and should always be avoided? Of course not. But it's simply something that you should consider. Be deliberate about your choices. Again, this is my tier list of badness of dependencies. If you just have libraries, you don't have a problem, because if it's just a function that gets you some data, swap it out and you're happy. Maybe you need to do some refactoring, but this is probably not so bad. And then there's the opinionated frameworks. They tend to infect everything because they not just provide functionality, but they also have a way of doing things, what I like to call ideology. Like, this needs to happen always in this way. I don't know, something like, reactive frameworks. You have data and your UI is computed from the data in whole. That's what I call an ideology, which doesn't mean it's bad. It's just something to keep in mind. This infests everything. And what I really like personally are UI toolkits, because then you're essentially outsourcing the entire user experience that you're building to somebody who might just decide to change everything up again or jack up the price or something. This is maximum exposure because this touches all your code and it also touches all your users. So you are doubly locked in, and this is maybe something that you should really think hard about before you add it to your project. Again, none of these are absolutes. I'm just throwing out some ideas how to think about minimalism and to simply be deliberate about your choices and your priorities. Don't just default to the thing that you've always done, because Angular will never go away. You don't really know this. I mean, I also think Angular will never go away, but do you know this? Are you willing to really bet big on this? Maybe you are, maybe you're not. I'm just wanting to place this in your head, that the authors of libraries and frameworks are not stable geniuses that will always be around. They are just guys like you. And they just write JavaScript all day. You can do too. I believe in you. So, in summary, less can be more. And we are after performance, productivity, and stability. Why? Well, of course, if we have less code, then we have less stuff that can break, and it's faster because it's not there. What isn't there cannot take up any CPU cycles or eat any frames. How do we implement minimalism? We've talked about the 3 general approaches: to eliminate some code, to move code to the platform, and to write specialized solutions. And always be mindful of the solution vendors who try to tell you that you definitely need their sort of product to, I don't know, deal with having to build a front end. Maybe you don't. Don't just listen to them. Also really analyze what you're doing. And then finally, if you need to pick some dependencies, be extremely mindful on what you're doing and what you're getting yourselves into. Think about the risk. Think about what happens if this or that becomes unusable for whatever reason. In this day and age, it can become unusable for really all reasons. I've already talked about stuff like, I don't know, tariffs. Could maybe affect your next UI framework that you pay the big bucks for. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Maybe tariffs won't ever happen again. But are you willing to bet on this? This is the real question that comes with every decision in front-end development. Are you sure that this is going to keep working? And I'm not even sure that HTML cables work, apparently. Okay, anyway, that's it from me. If you have any questions, excuse me, let me know. There's the slides. There's my employer. Scan the QR code or just talk to me if you want to learn more about headless content management systems with great visual previews. Apart from that, let me just mention that after lunch, I believe, I don't even remember, I'm going to be, I don't even remember, in some room at this conference talking about HTML5 form validation, which is, you get my vibe. But in this case, it's specialized about forms and form validation. Isn't this exciting? Yeah. You're lying, but I like you anyway. Thank you for being here. See you around.